The gunshot cracked through the trees before Elena even saw the animal. She dropped to her knees behind a fallen log, heart slamming against her ribs, and pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. Somewhere close, men were shouting to each other, moving fast through the dark woods with flashlights cutting through the fog. She had only come out here to check her rabbit traps before sunrise. She had not expected to stumble into the middle of a hunt. Then she heard it. A low, pained sound, half growl and half whimper, coming from a thicket just ahead of her. She should have run the other way. Every instinct told her to run the other way. Instead, she crawled forward, drawn by something she could not explain, and found him. A wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, lay on his side in the mud, blood soaking dark into his silver fur. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. One of his back legs was twisted at a wrong angle, and there was a wound near his shoulder that looked far too clean to be an accident. His eyes opened when she got close, and for a moment, Elena forgot to breathe. They were not the eyes of an ordinary animal. They looked at her the way a person looks at someone, searching, pleading, aware. The voices in the woods grew louder. Elena made a decision that would change everything. She grabbed the wolf under his front legs, ignoring the way her arms screamed under the weight of him, and dragged him toward the dry creek bed that ran behind her family's old farmhouse. It took nearly 20 minutes of pulling, resting, and pulling again, her boots sinking into the mud, her breath coming out in ragged clouds in the cold morning air. By the time she reached the barn, her hands were shaking, and her sleeve was soaked through with the wolf's blood. She had grown up on this farm her whole life. It used to be full of animals, full of noise, full of her father's laughter before he passed. Now it was just her and her mother, and the mother was too sick most days to leave her bed. The farm itself was barely holding on. There was a letter from the bank sitting unopened on the kitchen table, and Elena already knew what it said, because it was the third one that month. She should have been thinking about the mortgage. She should have been thinking about her shift at the clinic that started in 2 hours. Instead, she was on her knees in the hay, cleaning a wild animal's wounds with the emergency kit she kept for the farm dogs, whispering to him as if he could understand every word. By the time the sun was fully up, she had stitched the worst of the cuts, wrapped his leg the best she could with a splint made from an old broom handle, and covered him with a wool blanket. He had not moved the entire time, except once, when her hand brushed too close to the wound on his shoulder, and he let out a low sound of pain that made her stomach twist with guilt. She never made it to her shift at the veterinary clinic that day. Her manager called twice. She let both calls go to voicemail. She told herself she would explain later, that surely they would understand once she told them the truth, though she suspected they never would. People who worked in that town did not believe in wolves that looked like they understood English. They did not believe in the old stories the elderly folks whispered about the mountains behind the farm, stories about a hidden kingdom that lived just past the tree line, stories Elena had grown up hearing and never once believed. She believed something now, even if she could not name what it was. Over the following days, Elena's entire life folded itself around the wounded animal in her barn. She skipped another shift, then another, using the last of her savings to buy proper medicine from a pharmacy 2 towns over, one that would not ask questions about why a person needed suture kits and antibiotics meant for large animals. She stopped answering the bank's calls altogether. She stopped sleeping through the night, waking every few hours to check on him, terrified that she would find him gone still and cold in the hay. He did not die. Slowly, painfully, he began to heal. By the 4th day, he could lift his head. By the 6th, he could stand on 3 legs, leaning heavily against the barn wall while Elena held her breath and watched. By the 8th day, her manager left a message telling her not to bother coming back at all, and Elena sat on the floor of the barn and cried, not because she had lost her job, though that terrified her, but because she did not regret a single decision that led her there. The wolf watched her cry. He shuffled closer on unsteady legs and rested his head against her knee. And something about the gentleness of it, the impossible tenderness in a creature that size, made her cry harder instead of less. It was around this time that Elena began to notice she was being watched. At first, it was small things, a shape at the edge of the tree line that vanished the moment she looked directly at it, footprints in the frost near the fence line that were too large to belong to any animal she knew, and shaped strangely, as if whoever made them walked in a hurry, low to the ground. One evening, she found a fresh set of claw marks raked deep into the wood of the barn door, on the outside, facing in, as if something had stood there for a long time, deciding whether to come closer. She told herself it was her imagination, worn thin from exhaustion and grief, and the constant fear pressing down on her chest. She told herself the farm was simply old and the woods were simply wild, and none of it had anything to do with the wolf sleeping in her barn. She stopped believing that the night the horses screamed. It was well past midnight. Elena bolted upright in bed at the sound, her heart hammering, and ran outside barefoot into the cold to find both of her mother's remaining horses rearing against their stall doors, eyes wide and white with terror, straining against the wood as if trying to escape something Elena could not see. She grabbed the flashlight from the porch and swept it across the yard, and for one heartbeat, the beam caught two pairs of eyes at the tree line, low and gleaming, watching her without blinking. Then they were gone. She ran to the barn, certain she would find the wolf missing, certain that whatever was out there had come for him. Instead, she found him standing at the barn door, on all four legs now despite his healing wounds, his head lowered, a deep and steady growl rolling out of his chest as he stared into the darkness beyond the fence. He was protecting her. She realized it with a jolt that went through her whole body. Whatever was out there, he considered it a threat, and he had positioned himself between it and her without being asked. Elena knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his fur, not quite touching. "Whatever you are," she whispered, "thank you." He turned his head and looked at her, and in the moonlight, for just a moment, his eyes seemed almost human. The following morning brought the final letter from the bank. Elena opened it with hands that would not stop shaking, and read the words she had been dreading for months. The farm would be repossessed within 30 days unless the full amount owed was paid. 30 days. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her lap and did the math over and over, and no matter how she counted it, the number never worked in her favor. She had no job. She had almost no savings left. She had a sick mother upstairs who did not yet know how close they were to losing the only home she had left in the world. Elena did not cry this time. She had cried enough over the past week to last her a lifetime. Instead, she folded the letter, set it back on the table, and walked out to the barn, because it was the only place that still made sense to her. The wolf was waiting for her, standing steadier now than he had in days. When she stepped inside, he limped forward and pressed his head gently against her side, the way he had taken to doing whenever she looked tired or sad, and Elena wrapped her arms around his thick neck and let herself lean into him, just for a moment, just to feel like she was not carrying everything alone. She had no way of knowing that the creature she had saved was not simply a wild animal caught in a hunter's trap. She had no way of knowing that the men who had chased him through the woods that first morning were not hunters at all, but soldiers, sent by someone who very much wanted him dead before he could ever return to the place he had been born to rule. She had no way of knowing that by dragging him home and stitching his wounds with trembling hands, she had just placed herself directly between a stolen throne and the man who intended to reclaim it. All she knew, standing in that barn with her arms around him and her entire life falling apart around her, was that saving him had been the only decision in months that felt like the right one. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old barn doors, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to the farm, sharp and metallic and cold, the scent of something searching. The wolf lifted his head at once, ears pinned back, body tensing beneath Elena's hands. Somewhere out past the tree line, in the growing dark, more eyes were watching, and they were getting closer. Elena did not know it yet, But the 30 days on that letter from the bank would turn out to be the least of her problems. 3 nights later, Elena woke to the sound of something breaking inside the barn. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and ran outside in her bare feet, ignoring the frost biting into her skin, her mind racing through every terrible possibility. When she pushed open the barn door, what she found stopped her cold in the doorway. The wolf was gone. In his place stood a man. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair damp against his forehead, and eyes the exact same shade of pale gold that the wolf's had been. He wore nothing but the torn remains of her wool blanket wrapped around his waist, and there were fresh scars across his chest that had not been there the day before, as if his body had rearranged itself and left new marks behind in the process. He was gripping the wooden support beam of the barn so hard his knuckles had gone white, and his breathing was rough, like the transformation itself had cost him something enormous. Elena's flashlight clattered to the ground. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the man lifted his head and looked at her, and there was no mistaking those eyes, no mistaking the way his gaze softened the instant it landed on her face, the same way it had every single day she had sat beside him in that barn. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Twice now, if you count tonight, because that gunfire you heard the first morning was not the only time they came looking for me." Elena's back hit the doorframe. Her mind screamed at her to run, to scream, to do anything except stand frozen in place, but her body would not listen. "What are you?" she managed to whisper. "My name is Kale," he said, straightening slowly, wincing as he did. "I am not what you would call a wolf, not entirely. My people call themselves the Vareth. We live hidden, in the mountains behind this farm, in a world your kind stopped believing in a long time ago. I was betrayed by someone I trusted completely, someone who was supposed to protect our people the way I did, and I was left for dead in these woods to make sure I never came back to challenge him." Elena's mouth had gone dry. "Betrayed by who?" she asked, though some part of her already dreaded the answer. "My own brother," Kale said quietly. "Draven." The name hit the air like a dropped stone, heavy and final. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the night had become, and how impossibly small her barn now felt with this stranger standing inside it. A stranger who 3 days ago had been a dying animal bleeding out in her arms. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You could have just left. You could have run the moment you were strong enough, and I never would have known any of it." Kale took a slow step toward her, careful, the way someone approaches a startled animal, rather than the other way around. "Because where I come from," he said, "a debt like the one I owe you is sacred. You gave up everything to save a creature you did not understand, expecting nothing in return. That kind of sacrifice binds us, whether either of us wanted it or not. I cannot simply walk away from that, and I would not want to even if I could." Before Elena could respond, a sound cut through the night outside, distant but unmistakable, the low rumble of engines coming up the dirt road that led to the farm. Kale's entire body went rigid. His head snapped toward the door, nostrils flaring, and the warmth that had briefly softened his face vanished entirely, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. "They found me," he said. "We need to move, now." Elena barely had time to process the words before headlights swept across the yard outside, cutting through the dark in long white beams. Kale grabbed her hand, his grip firm but careful, and pulled her toward the back of the barn just as the first shout rang out from the direction of the driveway. "Get down," he whispered, pulling her behind a stack of old hay bales as the barn door burst open and 3 men stepped inside, dressed in dark clothing, moving with a controlled, disciplined efficiency that made Elena's stomach drop. These were not local hunters. These men moved like soldiers. One of them raised a device that glowed faintly blue and swept it slowly across the barn. "My Lord Draven was right," the man said quietly to the others. "His scent is fresh. He has been healing here." Kale's jaw tightened beside her. Elena could feel the tension radiating off him, could see the muscles in his arm flexing as if every part of him wanted to lunge forward and end this right now, but he held himself perfectly still, one hand pressed lightly against her shoulder in silent warning. "Search the property," the lead man ordered. "If the girl is hiding him, she goes down with him. Draven does not want witnesses." Elena's blood turned to ice. She looked at Kale, and for the first time since she had found him bleeding in the mud, she saw real fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. They began moving through the barn, checking stalls, kicking over crates, their flashlights sweeping closer and closer to the hay bales, where Elena and Kale crouched in the dark. Kale's hand slid slowly to Elena's wrist, and he mouthed a single word to her: "Run." Elena shook her head, refusing, but Kale's expression left no room for argument. "When I move," he whispered, so quiet it was barely more than breath, "you run for the house and you do not stop, no matter what you hear." Before she could protest, one of the men rounded the hay bales and their eyes met. "There," the man shouted, raising his weapon. Kale moved faster than anything Elena had ever seen. In one motion he was on his feet, shoving her hard toward the back door of the barn even as his body began to shift, bones cracking and reshaping beneath his skin in a horrifying, beautiful blur of motion. By the time the man's weapon fired, Kale was no longer standing where a human had been. He was already moving, already closing the distance, a streak of silver and fury in the dark. Elena stumbled backward through the door exactly as he had told her to, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, and ran. She did not get far. The old wooden fence at the edge of the yard, weakened by years of storms and neglect, gave way beneath her weight as she vaulted over it in a panic, and she went down hard, pain exploding through her ankle as she hit the frozen ground. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the fight continuing in the barn, snarls and shouts and the sharp crack of something breaking, and she forced herself up despite the pain, limping toward the farmhouse with tears streaming down her face. She was almost to the porch steps when the barn behind her lit up in flames. She spun around in horror, watching orange light devour the old wooden structure, the same barn where she had spent nights nursing Kale back to health, where every dollar of her savings had gone into medicine and bandages, where the last physical trace of her father's old life on this farm still stood before that moment. It collapsed inward within minutes, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky, and Elena sank to her knees in the frost, sobbing, certain that Kale was gone with it. He was not. He emerged from the trees at the edge of the property some time later, human again, bloodied and limping badly, but alive. He crossed the yard toward her without a word and knelt in front of her, his hands hovering over her injured ankle, over the tears on her face, as if he did not know where to begin apologizing for everything her kindness had cost her. "I am sorry," he said finally, his voice breaking with something raw. "I never meant for any of this to touch you. You saved a stranger and it burned down everything you had left." Elena looked past him at the smoking ruins of the barn, then at the dark shape of the farmhouse behind her, the home she now had no way to save from the bank, the home she might lose in less than 30 days regardless of what happened tonight. Something inside her, some quiet, exhausted part of her, finally broke loose. "Then help me fix it," she said, her voice shaking but certain. "You said you owed me a debt. I am telling you exactly what I need from you to repay it. Help me save what is left, because I have nothing left to lose by trusting you now." Kale studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his golden eyes, something that looked almost like resolve hardening into purpose. "Then I will not only help you save this farm," he said quietly. "I will make sure my brother pays for every single thing he has taken from you tonight, and everything he has taken from my people while I was gone." In the distance, sirens began to wail, drawn by the smoke rising over the tree line, and Elena realized with a sinking heart that explaining any of this to the arriving fire crew would be the least complicated problem she would face from that night forward. The fire crew never learned the truth about what happened that night. Cale was gone from the property long before the trucks arrived, slipping into the tree line the moment Elena promised him she would be safe on her own for the rest of the night. She told the firefighters an old propane tank must have caught a spark, and though the fire chief gave her a long, doubtful look, no one pressed further. People in that town had learned, over generations, not to ask too many questions about strange fires near those particular woods. By morning, Elena stood in the ashes of her barn with a cup of cold coffee going untouched in her hands, staring at the wreckage of the one place that had made sense to her over the past week. Her mother, weak but awake, sat wrapped in blankets on the porch, watching her daughter with tired, worried eyes. "You have not been yourself lately," her mother said quietly, "ever since that morning you came back covered in blood that was not yours." Elena did not know how to explain any of it, so for the first time in her life, she told her mother almost everything. The wolf, the transformation, the men who came in the night. Her mother listened without interrupting, and when Elena finally finished, she reached out and took her daughter's hand with surprising strength. "Your grandmother used to tell stories about the mountain people," she said. "I always thought they were just stories to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. I am sorry I never believed you sooner." That afternoon, Cale returned, moving carefully through the tree line until he was certain no one else was watching. He had changed clothes somewhere, wearing a plain dark jacket that looked borrowed rather than owned, and he carried himself differently than he had the night before, straighter, more composed, like a man settling back into a role he had not worn in a long time. "I spoke with the ones who still remain loyal to me," he told Elena once they were alone by the ruined barn. "There are people among my pack who never accepted my brother's claim to the throne. They have been waiting, hoping I would return. If I go back now, with proof of what Draven has done, I have a real chance of taking back what is mine." Elena wrapped her arms around herself against the cold morning air. "And what happens to me in all of this?" she asked. "Your brother already sent men to kill me because I helped you. I do not exactly have the option of staying out of it now." Cale's expression turned serious. "That is exactly why I am asking you to come with me," he said. "Not because you owe me anything more than you already have given, but because it is no longer safe for you here. Draven's people know your face and your name. The only place you will truly be protected is inside Verath territory, under my authority, where pack law still means something even to those who oppose me." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing the impossibility of everything happening to her against the reality standing right in front of her, solid and real despite how unbelievable it should have been. "And the farm?" she finally asked. "My mother." "There is a way to protect this place as well," Cale said carefully. "My people have resources your world does not. Gold and gems from old mountain vaults that have sat untouched for generations. It would be enough to clear the debt on this land many times over, and to make sure your mother is cared for by the finest healers among us. Healers whose medicine goes back centuries beyond anything in your hospitals. I offer this freely, not as charity, but as the debt I owe you, finally repaid in full." For the first time since the bank's final letter arrived, Elena allowed herself to feel something close to hope. She spent the rest of that day arranging things with a speed that left her dizzy. A cousin agreed to stay with her mother and manage the farm while Elena was away, told only that she had found temporary work out of state, a lie that tasted bitter but felt necessary. By evening, she stood at the edge of the tree line with a single bag over her shoulder, looking back one last time at the farmhouse growing smaller behind her, wondering if she would ever see it the same way again. The walk into the mountains took most of the night. Cale led her along paths that did not appear on any map, through passes that seemed to bend and shift the deeper they went, until the ordinary forest gave way to something Elena could hardly believe with her own eyes. Hidden valleys opened up between the peaks, lit by strings of lanterns strung between ancient trees, wooden halls carved directly into stone cliffs, and everywhere she looked, people moving through the dusk, who were not entirely people at all, their eyes catching the lantern light the way an animal's would in the dark. Word of Cale's return spread through the valley before they had even reached the central hall. By the time they arrived, a crowd had gathered, some faces lighting with disbelief and relief, others watching with open suspicion, their eyes darting between Cale and the human woman walking at his side. An older woman broke from the crowd first, moving with the quick, urgent steps of someone who refused to believe good news until she confirmed it with her own hands. She threw her arms around Cale before he could even greet her properly, and when she pulled back, there were tears on her weathered face. "We thought you were dead," she said, her voice breaking. "Draven told the whole pack you had died in the human world, that your throne passed to him by right of succession." Cale's jaw tightened. "My throne was never his to claim, Mira. I intend to make that very clear." Mira's gaze shifted to Elena, sharp and evaluating in a way that made Elena straighten under the scrutiny. "And who is this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "This is Elena," Cale said, and something in the way he said her name made the crowd around them go quiet. "She saved my life when I had nothing left. Without her, I would not be standing here at all." A ripple of murmurs moved through the gathered pack. Elena caught fragments of conversation she was not meant to hear, words like debt bond and blood tie and mate scent, terms she did not fully understand, but that clearly carried enormous weight among these people. She felt suddenly, painfully exposed, a human standing in the middle of a world built entirely on rules she had never been taught. Mira studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "If she carries your debt bond," Mira said carefully to Cale, "then Draven's people will see her as a target the moment they learn where she stands. You know this." "I know," Cale said quietly, "which is why I intend to claim her formally, before the full council, before we move against Draven. If she is recognized as bonded to me under pack law, harming her becomes a crime against the throne itself, one that even Draven's strongest allies would hesitate to commit openly." Elena's stomach dropped. "Claim me," she repeated. "As what, exactly?" Cale turned to her, his expression careful, almost apologetic. "As my chosen mate," he said. "Not truly, not unless you wished it to become real over time, but formally, publicly, in a way our laws recognize and protect. It would be the strongest shield I can offer you against my brother's people, while we build the case against him. I would never ask this of you if there were another way to keep you safe." Elena looked around at the crowd of unfamiliar faces watching her, at the ancient stone halls rising up around them in the moonlight, at the man who 3 days ago had been a dying wolf bleeding out in her barn, and was now asking her to stand beside him as something close to royalty in a hidden kingdom she had not known existed that morning. Everything about her old life felt 1,000 miles away, and the ground beneath her felt like it was still shifting. "Fine," she said finally, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "If it keeps me alive long enough to see my mother again, then fine, I will do it." Mira's eyes flicked between the two of them, something unreadable passing across her expression, before she gave a slow nod and turned to address the crowd in a language Elena did not recognize, sharp and musical and old. Whatever she said sent a wave of reaction through the gathered pack, some nodding solemnly, others exchanging glances that were far less welcoming. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a young man with sharp features and cold eyes turned and slipped quietly away into the dark, moving with the same disciplined efficiency Elena had seen in the men who burned down her barn. She did not notice him leave. She had no way of knowing that within the hour, word of her presence and of Cale's plan to claim her before the council would already be traveling toward Draven's stronghold on the far side of the mountain. The debt Cale owed her had just placed her directly in the path of a war she had not chosen, and there would be no walking away from it now. The council hall was carved from the same pale stone as the cliffs surrounding it, its walls lined with old banners bearing a silver wolf crest that Elena now understood belonged to Cale's family line. She stood at the center of it the next morning, dressed in a plain gray dress someone from the household had left outside her door before dawn, feeling every pair of eyes in the room settle on her at once. The council itself consisted of a dozen elders seated in a wide semicircle, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open hostility. Mira stood near the front, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the tension of someone bracing for trouble. Kale stood beside Elena, steady and composed, though she could feel the tightness in his hand where it rested near hers. An elder with silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes rose first. Kale, son of Aldrich, you stand before this council claiming your father's throne, stolen from you by your own brother. You also bring a human before us, claiming a formal bond scarcely a week after your return. Explain yourself. Kale's voice, when he spoke, carried easily through the hall. I claim the throne because it is mine by right and by blood, and because Draven took it through betrayal, not succession. As for Elena, he continued, glancing briefly at her, she saved my life at the cost of nearly everything she owned. I claim the bond to honor that debt, and to protect her from the consequences of my brother's cruelty, consequences she never should have had to face. A younger council member, a stocky man with hard eyes, stood abruptly. Convenient, he said, that a human should appear at exactly the moment you needed a symbol of sacrifice to win sympathy from this council. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, less from embarrassment than anger. Before Kale could respond, she spoke for herself, her voice steadier than she expected. I did not know what he was when I found him bleeding in the woods, she said, looking directly at the man who had spoken. I did not know about thrones or councils or debts. I only knew something was dying, and I could not walk away from that. If that makes me convenient, then I suppose I am guilty of caring about a stranger's life. A murmur moved through the hall, and Elena caught something shift in a few of the elders' expressions, doubt softening into something closer to respect. Mira, watching from the side, allowed herself the faintest smile. The silver-haired elder studied Elena for a long moment before speaking again. Sacrifice freely given carries weight among our people, more weight than most humans could understand. If the bond is confirmed by ritual, it cannot be undone by council decree, only by the will of those bonded. Do you understand what you agree to, human? I am beginning to, Elena said honestly, and something in her answer seemed to satisfy the room more than a confident lie would have. The ritual itself was simple, almost anticlimactic after the tension leading up to it. Kale and Elena stood before the council, while Mira drew a symbol on each of their palms using a dark red paste made from mountain herbs, then pressed their hands together and spoke words in the old language that Elena did not understand but felt somehow settle into her chest like a weight finding its proper place. When their hands parted, a faint mark remained on both their palms, silver and pale, fading slowly over the following minutes, but leaving behind a warmth that lingered far longer. It is done, Mira announced to the hall. The bond is recognized. Any harm brought against Elena is now, by law, harm brought against the throne itself. The council session ended with a vote to support Kale's claim against Draven, though not unanimously. 3 elders abstained, their expressions carefully neutral, and Elena noticed the hard-eyed man who had challenged her leave the hall without a word to anyone, his jaw tight with barely restrained frustration. That evening, Kale found Elena sitting alone on a stone balcony overlooking the valley, watching the last light fade behind the mountain peaks. He settled beside her without asking, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You handled yourself well in there, he said. Better than most of my own people would have, faced with all of that at once. Elena turned her palm over, studying the faint silver mark still visible on her skin. I keep waiting to wake up back in my own bed, she admitted. None of this feels real yet. A week ago, I was worried about paying the electric bill. Now I am apparently married to a king under some ancient wolf ritual I do not fully understand. Kale's mouth curved into something close to a smile, the first real one she had seen from him. Not married. Not exactly, he corrected gently. Bonded. It is a promise, a shield, not a binding contract of forever unless both people choose to make it one. What happens between us from here is still entirely up to you. Elena studied his profile in the fading light, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his golden eyes softened whenever they landed on her, and felt something warm and unfamiliar stir beneath the exhaustion and fear that had defined the past week. "I do not regret finding you in those woods," she said quietly. "Even with everything that has happened since, I want you to know that." Kale reached over and gently took her hand, the one still marked with the fading ritual symbol, and pressed it lightly to his lips. "Then, whatever comes next," he said, "we face it together." Their quiet moment did not last long. A guard appeared at the edge of the balcony, breathless from running, his face pale with urgency. "My king," he said, bowing quickly. "Scouts have returned from the eastern ridge. Draven's forces are mobilizing. They know about the bond ceremony. He is calling it an insult to pack law, claiming a human cannot legally hold the position Elena has been given." Kale rose immediately, all warmth vanishing from his expression, replaced by the sharp focus of a leader preparing for conflict. "Let him make his claims," Kale said. "He knows as well as I do that pack law favors sacrifice and bonded protection above all else. He is not challenging the law. He is looking for an excuse to move against us before our support grows too strong to fight." The guard hesitated before continuing. "There is more, my king. He has taken hostages from villages loyal to your father's memory, families who spoke out in support of your return. He says he will release them only if you surrender the throne and hand over the human woman for judgment." Elena's stomach turned to ice. "Judgment," she repeated. "For what?" "For daring to bind herself to the true king," the guard said grimly. "He is calling it treason against his rule." Kale's hands curled into fists at his sides, and for a moment, Elena saw something dangerous flash behind his controlled expression, something that reminded her sharply that the man standing beside her was not simply a wounded stranger she had nursed back to health, but a king whose people's lives now hung in the balance because of choices they had made together. "Gather the loyal houses," Kale said finally, his voice hard and steady. "We move at first light. I will not let my brother hold innocent lives hostage to force my hand, and I will not hand Elena over to him under any circumstance, judgment or otherwise." As the guard hurried off to relay the orders, Elena reached out and took Kale's hand again, steadying him the same way she had steadied herself against his side that first terrifying night in the barn. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "I am not running from this. I chose this the moment I dragged you out of those woods, whether I understood what I was choosing or not." Kale turned to look at her, something fierce and grateful passing across his face, and for the first time since arriving in this hidden world, Elena felt less like a frightened outsider and more like someone who truly belonged beside the man standing next to her, no matter what battle waited for them at first light. Below them, in the valley, torches were already being lit along the training grounds as loyal fighters began preparing for a conflict that had been building since the night Draven left his own brother for dead in the woods. Elena watched the flickering lights spread across the darkness and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that there would be no quiet ending to this story, not until the throne Draven had stolen was answered for in full. Dawn broke gray and cold over the valley, and by the time the first light touched the training grounds, nearly 200 fighters had gathered beneath the Silver Wolf banners, loyal houses answering Kale's call from every corner of Vareth territory. Elena stood near the edge of the assembly, wrapped in a borrowed cloak against the chill, watching Kale move among his people with a calm authority that made it easy to forget, for a moment, that he had been a dying animal bleeding out in her barn less than 2 weeks earlier. Mira approached her quietly while Kale finished his instructions to the assembled fighters. "You should stay behind the main line today," Mira said, not unkindly. "You are not trained for this kind of conflict, and Kale would lose his focus worrying over you in the middle of a fight." "I am not asking to fight," Elena said. But I am not staying behind in the valley while everyone else risks their lives for a mess that started because of me. If there is any way I can help, I want to know it." Mira studied her for a long moment, something considering in her expression. "There may be something," she said finally. "Draven holds the hostages in the old watchtower on the eastern ridge, lightly guarded compared to his main force, because he expects Cale to bring the fight directly to him rather than split his attention. If someone quiet, someone the guards would not immediately recognize as a threat, could slip in and free those hostages during the main confrontation, it could turn the entire battle in our favor before it truly begins." Elena's heart pounded, half fear and half something close to determination. "I can do that," she said. Cale, when he learned of the plan an hour later, argued against it fiercely, pacing the length of the war tent with barely restrained frustration. "Absolutely not," he said. "I did not bring you into this world to send you straight into my brother's stronghold." "I am not asking your permission," Elena said evenly, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I am telling you what I intend to do, because it is the best chance those hostages have, and because I refuse to spend this entire fight hiding behind a rock feeling useless while people are risking everything on my account." Cale stared at her, torn between fear for her safety and something that looked almost like pride at the steel in her voice. Finally, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Take Mira with you," he said, "and if anything goes wrong, anything at all, you run. Do you understand me? You run, and you do not look back to see how the fight is going." Elena nodded, though privately she was not certain she would keep that particular promise. The plan unfolded exactly as the sun climbed higher over the ridge. Cale led the main force in a direct approach toward Draven's stronghold, drawing the bulk of his brother's fighters into a tense standoff at the base of the mountain, while Elena and Mira circled wide through a narrow game trail toward the old watchtower on the eastern side. The watchtower guards, as Mira predicted, were few, their attention fixed on the growing confrontation visible in the distance below. Elena and Mira moved quickly and quietly, taking advantage of the guards' distraction, slipping through a half-collapsed section of the outer wall that Mira apparently knew from some earlier point in her life she did not explain. Inside, they found the hostages, 7 villagers ranging from an elderly man to a frightened boy no older than 10, huddled together in a locked storage room. Mira made quick work of the old iron lock while Elena kept watch at the door, her pulse hammering in her ears. "We need to move fast," Mira whispered once the door swung open. "The moment they are missed, this entire tower will be swarming." They had made it nearly to the collapsed wall, hostages moving as quickly and quietly as fear would allow, when a shout rang out behind them. One of the guards had returned early, discovering the empty storage room, and his alarm brought 3 more running within seconds. "Go," Mira ordered Elena, shoving her toward the wall as she turned to face the approaching guards. "Get them out. I will hold here as long as I can." Elena hesitated only a moment before grabbing the boy's hand and pulling the group of villagers through the gap in the wall, urging them down the narrow trail as fast as their legs could carry them. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of fighting, Mira's sharp commands mixing with the guards' shouts, and every instinct screamed at her to turn back and help. She did not turn back. She kept moving, because Mira's sacrifice would mean nothing if the hostages did not make it to safety. They reached the tree line just as reinforcements from Cale's forces, alerted by a runner Elena had sent ahead with the fastest of the freed villagers, arrived to secure the trail. Elena collapsed against a tree, breathing hard, watching as the villagers were guided toward safety, relief and exhaustion crashing over her in equal measure. It was only then that she remembered Mira, still fighting somewhere back at the tower, and the guilt of leaving her behind hit like a physical blow. She did not have time to dwell on it. A commotion rippled through the fighters around her, and Elena turned to see the main battle shifting, Draven's forces suddenly breaking formation, some retreating, others being overwhelmed, as word spread through their ranks that the hostages Draven had used as leverage were already free, stripping away the one advantage he had counted on to force Cale's surrender. Elena pushed through the chaos toward the sound of Kale's voice, finding him at the center of the fighting, locked in a fierce exchange with a man who could only be Draven himself, sharing Kale's build and features but with cold, calculating eyes that held none of his brother's warmth. The two circled each other, both wolves now, silver and dark, snapping and lunging with a speed that made Elena's heart lodge in her throat. Around her, the tide of the battle continued shifting in Kale's favor as more of Draven's supporters, seeing their leverage collapse and their leader's forces faltering, began withdrawing from the fight entirely rather than continue supporting a claim that was crumbling in front of them. The fight between the two brothers ended not in violence, but in submission. Draven, cornered and outnumbered as his remaining forces abandoned him, finally shifted back to human form and dropped to his knees on the battlefield, breathing hard, his cold eyes finally showing something like fear as Kale stood over him, equally human once more, chest heaving with exertion and barely restrained fury. "You had every chance to rule honestly," Kale said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent battlefield. "Instead, you chose betrayal, and you nearly cost innocent people their lives to protect a throne you never should have taken in the first place." Draven said nothing, his jaw clenched, hatred and humiliation warring across his features. Elena found Mira soon after, bruised and limping but very much alive, having held off the guards at the watchtower long enough for reinforcements to arrive and turn the tide. Elena threw her arms around the older woman without thinking, overwhelmed with relief. "You are tougher than you look, human," Mira said, though there was warmth beneath the gruff words, and something that sounded almost like respect. As the sun began to set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red, Elena stood beside Kale on the battlefield, watching as Draven was led away in restraints to await formal judgment before the full council. It was over, or nearly over, and for the first time since that first gunshot had cracked through the trees weeks earlier, Elena allowed herself to believe that she might finally get to see what peace looked like on the other side of everything she had lost and everything she had fought to save. Kale turned to her, exhaustion and something far softer mixing in his golden eyes. "It is done," he said quietly. "My brother's rebellion is finished." Elena reached for his hand, the faint silver mark on both their palms catching the last light of the setting sun. "Not finished," she said gently. "Just beginning." The formal trial was set to take place 3 days later, giving the council time to gather testimony from the villages Draven had threatened and from the soldiers who had defected once his position began to crumble. Elena spent those 3 days helping tend to the wounded alongside the pack's healers, grateful for something useful to do with her hands, while the weight of everything that had happened slowly settled over her. It was during the second night, while she carried fresh linens through the healing hall, that she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 2 guards stood near a side entrance, speaking in low, urgent tones. "He cannot be tried," one of them was saying. "If the council hears everything he knows about the old vault, about the arrangement with the northern packs, it will not only be his downfall, it will expose half the loyal houses who quietly supported his claim before the tide turned against him. Then he needs to disappear before the trial," the other muttered. Quietly, "No one will ask too many questions if the humans' people are blamed for it." Elena froze behind a support column, pressing herself into the shadows, her heart hammering. She waited until the guards moved off before hurrying to find Kale, nearly running through the stone corridors in her haste. She found him reviewing testimony scrolls with 2 of the council elders, and the moment he saw her face, he dismissed the elders without hesitation, crossing the room to her side. "What happened?" he asked, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. Elena relayed the conversation as clearly as she could remember it, watching Kale's expression darken with each word. "Someone intends to silence Draven before he can testify," she finished. "And they want it to look like it was done because of me, because I am human." Kale's jaw tightened. "That would destroy everything," he said quietly. Not just Draven's testimony, but the fragile trust I have been trying to rebuild with my people since returning. If it looks like harm came to my own brother under my rule, and that a human was blamed for it, it would confirm every fear my father's old advisors ever had about outsiders in our world. "We need to protect him," Elena said, the words feeling strange in her mouth given everything Draven had done. Not because he deserves it, but because the truth deserves to come out properly, in front of the whole council, not buried in some quiet act of violence in the dark. Kale moved quickly, doubling the guard around the cell where Draven was being held and personally overseeing the arrangements for the remainder of the night. But whoever had spoken those words in the healing hall was patient, and it was not until the following evening, mere hours before the trial was set to begin, that the true danger revealed itself. An explosion rocked the eastern wing of the stone fortress just after sunset, the sound echoing through the valley loud enough to send birds scattering from every tree for miles. Elena, who had been walking with Kale toward the evening council briefing, felt the ground shudder beneath her feet as smoke began pouring from the direction of the holding cells. "They are trying to free him," Kale said grimly, already moving toward the chaos, Elena close behind him despite his attempts to tell her to stay back. "If Draven escapes now, before he can testify, everything we accomplished on that battlefield means nothing. He will rebuild his support in exile and come back stronger, angrier, and far more dangerous than before." They reached the holding cells to find the outer wall breached and the guards scattered, several wounded, one unconscious near the entrance. The cell itself stood empty, its heavy door torn from its hinges by something far stronger than ordinary tools. A trail of disturbed earth led toward the northern pass, the same route, Kale realized with grim recognition, that connected Vareth territory to the northern packs Draven had apparently been quietly courting as allies even during his rule. Someone had helped him vanish, and they had done it with enough force and precision to suggest real resources behind the effort. "I have to go after him," Kale said, already shifting his weight toward the trail, urgency radiating off him. "If he crosses into northern territory tonight, we lose any chance of bringing him to justice, and any chance of learning what he was truly planning before his rebellion collapsed." Elena grabbed his arm before he could move. "Not alone," she said firmly, "and not without a plan. You just spent days convincing your council that impulsive action nearly cost your people everything once already. Do not become the very mistake you are trying to correct." Kale hesitated, torn between the fire in his chest and the truth in her words. Around them, guards were already regrouping, Mira arriving at a run with a handful of fighters close behind her, already assessing the damage and calling out orders to secure the perimeter. "We track him properly," Mira said, arriving in time to catch the tail end of the conversation. "Quietly, carefully, with enough force to bring him back, but not so much that we start a war with the northern packs before we even know whether they knowingly helped him or were used without their leadership's full awareness." Kale exhaled slowly, nodding despite the tension still radiating through his shoulders. "Fine," he said. "We move at first light, with a small team, quiet and fast. I want him back here in chains before the sun sets tomorrow." That night, as preparations were made for the pursuit, Elena sat with Kale in the quiet of his private chamber, watching him clean and check a set of blades laid out across the table with the focused intensity of someone preparing for something far more dangerous than he was letting on. "You do not have to go," she said quietly. "Send Mira. Send your best fighters. You just reclaimed a throne that people bled for. You cannot afford to disappear into northern territory chasing your brother." Kale looked up at her, something tired and honest in his expression. "If I do not finish this myself," he said, "it will follow us for years. My people need to see that I face consequences directly, not from a distance, not through others fighting my battles for me. And I need you to understand something, Elena. Wherever this bond between us goes from here, I will not be the kind of king who lets others carry the weight I should be carrying myself." Elena reached across the table and took his hand, the faint silver mark still visible between their palms even now. "Then I am coming with you," she said. "Not to fight, but because I refuse to sit in this fortress wondering whether you are alive while you chase your brother across a mountain range I do not even know the name of." Kale studied her for a long moment, and though every protective instinct in him clearly wanted to argue, something in her steady expression told him it would be a wasted effort. "Fine," he said finally, the corner of his mouth lifting despite the tension of the night. "But you stay close to Mira, and if I tell you to run, you run without hesitation this time." Outside, the moon rose high and cold over the mountains, casting long silver light across the northern pass, where Draven and whoever had helped him escape were already putting distance between themselves and the fortress. Elena watched the light fall across Kale's tired, determined face and understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that the story that had begun with a dying wolf in the mud was far from finished, and that whatever waited for them in the northern mountains would test everything they had built together far more than the battle they had already survived. The northern pass was colder than anything Elena had experienced in her life, wind cutting through even the heaviest furs the household had provided her before departure. She rode near the center of the small pursuit party, flanked by Mira on one side and a quiet, watchful fighter named Owen on the other, while Kale ranged ahead with 2 scouts, tracking a trail that grew fainter with every passing hour. By midday, the scouts returned with grim news. "The trail splits here," one of them reported, kneeling beside a set of tracks pressed into the thin mountain snow. "Several sets head toward the northern settlement, but one set breaks off here, moving alone, toward the old ruins above the tree line." Kale studied the tracks for a long moment before straightening. "That is Draven," he said. "He knows we would expect him to run to the northern pack for shelter. Splitting off alone means he wants us divided, chasing shadows in 2 directions while he disappears somewhere we would never think to look." Mira frowned. "The old ruins have been abandoned since before your father's time," she said. "Nothing up there but crumbling stone and old graves. Why would he go there?" Kale's expression shifted, something clicking into place behind his eyes. "Because the old vault is up there," he said quietly. "The one the guards mentioned in that conversation Elena overheard. If there is something in that vault valuable enough to be worth this much risk, Draven would want it before he vanishes for good." They split their forces, sending the majority toward the northern settlement to investigate any knowing involvement from the pack leadership there, while Kale, Elena, Mira, and Owen continued alone toward the ruins, moving quickly along a narrow trail that wound higher into the mountains, the air growing thinner and colder with every mile. The ruins, when they finally reached them as the afternoon light began to fade, were more extensive than Elena had expected. Ancient stone archways and collapsed towers scattered across a wide plateau, half buried in snow and silence. It felt, Elena thought, like walking through the skeleton of a kingdom that had died a very long time ago. They found Draven near the center of the ruins, kneeling before a stone door set into the side of a collapsed tower, working at an old mechanism with quick, desperate movements. He looked up at their approach, and for a moment, Elena saw something almost like relief cross his features, quickly buried beneath the same cold defiance he had shown on the battlefield. "You should not have come alone," Draven said, rising slowly, brushing snow from his knees. "It is almost sentimental, brother, how predictable you remain." Kale stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Elena without seeming to think about it. "It is over, Draven," he said. "Whatever you think is behind that door is not worth what it will cost you to keep running." Draven laughed, low and humorless. "You have no idea what is behind this door," he said. "Our father sealed something here before he died, something he was too afraid to ever use, something that could have ended this entire conflict before it began if I had simply been willing to do what he was not. I intend to open it, and I intend to make sure our people finally understand who was truly willing to do whatever it took to protect them." Before anyone could respond, the mechanism beneath Draven's hands gave a final click, and the stone door ground open with a low, grinding sound that echoed across the empty ruins. Cold air rushed out from the darkness beyond, carrying with it a strange, metallic scent that made every hair on Elena's arms stand on end. Kale's expression shifted from anger to alarm in an instant. "Draven, do not," he said sharply, moving forward. "Whatever Father sealed in there, he sealed it for a reason. You do not understand what you are dealing with." "I understand perfectly well," Draven snapped, stepping through the doorway into the darkness. "I understand that our Father chose fear over strength, and it cost our people generations of weakness, while other packs grew stronger around us. I will not make the same mistake." A low growl echoed from somewhere deep within the chamber, ancient and enormous, and Elena felt Kale's entire body go rigid beside her. "That is not gold in there," Kale said quietly, urgently, grabbing Owen's arm. "That is the bound one, the creature my great-grandfather's generation captured and sealed away because it could not be killed, only contained. If Draven releases it thinking he can control it, he will destroy us all." The sound from within the chamber grew louder, a deep, resonant snarl that seemed to shake the very stones of the ruins, and a massive shape began to move within the darkness, easily 3 times the size of anything Elena had seen among Kale's people, its eyes glowing a sickly green in the dim light. Draven stumbled backward out of the chamber, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by raw terror as the creature's massive form began pressing toward the opening, claws the length of Elena's forearm scraping against ancient stone. "Run!" Kale shouted, shoving Elena and Mira toward the tree line even as he shifted, his body tearing through his clothing as he transformed, placing himself between the emerging creature and the rest of the group. Owen followed suit an instant later, both wolves circling the enormous, snarling shape as it fully emerged from the chamber, shaking centuries of dust from a hide covered in old, terrible scars. Elena did not run far. She stopped at the tree line, pulling Draven, who had frozen in place, terror overriding whatever remained of his earlier bravado, along with her. "What is that thing?" she demanded, shaking him. "A punishment," Draven said, his voice hollow, all traces of his earlier arrogance stripped away. "Our ancestors bound something that should never have existed at all, something born from an old alliance gone wrong. I thought, if I could control it, if I could bring it back leashed and obedient, I would prove myself stronger than my brother ever could be. I was wrong. I was so wrong." The battle that followed was unlike anything Elena had witnessed on the earlier battlefield. Kale and Owen worked together with brutal, practiced coordination, drawing the creature's attention, darting in and out of its reach, buying time rather than seeking to land a killing blow that neither of them seemed to believe was possible. Mira, meanwhile, worked feverishly at the ancient mechanism beside the stone door, muttering under her breath as she studied markings along its edge. "There is a binding chant," she called out, urgency sharpening her voice. "My grandmother taught me fragments of it once, said it was old protection magic. I do not know if I remember enough of it to work, but it is the only chance we have of sealing that thing away again before it kills someone." Elena did not hesitate. "Tell me what to do," she said, moving to Mira's side. Together, they worked at the mechanism, while Kale and Owen continued to hold the creature's attention, both wolves growing visibly exhausted as the fight dragged on, blood-matting fur, movements growing slower with every passing minute. Elena's hands shook as she repeated the strange, ancient words Mira fed her, praying she was pronouncing them correctly, praying it would be enough. The chamber door began to glow faintly as Mira finished the final line of the chant, a pale silver light spreading from the ancient stone, and the creature let out a furious, pained roar as an invisible force began dragging it backward toward the opening, fighting every step of the way. Kale, seizing the opportunity, drove it back with one final, desperate charge, and the moment its massive form crossed the threshold, the stone door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire plateau, sealing the chamber once more in silence. Kale shifted back to human form immediately, dropping to his knees, breathing hard, blood running freely from several deep wounds along his side. Elena was at his side in an instant, pressing her hands against the worst of the bleeding, her heart pounding with a fear far sharper than anything she had felt during the entire ordeal. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely, tears blurring her vision. "Do not you dare give up now, not after everything we have survived to get here." Cale's hand found hers, weak but certain, his golden eyes finding her face even through the pain. "I am not going anywhere," he managed, a faint, exhausted smile touching his lips despite everything. "Not while you are still here fighting to keep me." Behind them, Draven sank to the snow-covered ground, staring at the sealed chamber door, the full weight of what his ambition had nearly unleashed finally settling over him, and for the first time since Elena had met him, he looked less like a dangerous rival and more like a man forced to confront exactly how far his own choices had nearly carried them all toward disaster. The journey back to the fortress took 2 full days, slowed by Cale's injuries despite the healing salves Mira applied at every stop along the trail. Elena stayed close to his side the entire way, refusing to leave his wagon, even when Owen offered to take a shift watching over him so she could rest. Draven, restrained and silent, rode near the back of the group, watched carefully by 2 guards, his earlier defiance replaced by something quieter and far more subdued. They arrived at the fortress gates just as evening settled over the valley, and word of what had happened at the ruins spread through the pack almost immediately, carried by the fastest riders sent ahead to prepare the healers. By the time Cale was carried into the healing hall, a crowd had already gathered, murmuring in disbelief at the story spreading among them that their king had faced down the Bound One itself and survived. The trial, delayed by 2 days while Cale recovered enough to attend, finally took place in the Great Hall before the full council and a larger crowd of onlookers than Elena had expected, word of recent events having drawn attendance from every corner of Vareth territory. Elena stood near the front beside Mira, watching as Draven was brought before the council in restraints, his head bowed, none of his earlier arrogance remaining. The testimony took most of the day. Villagers spoke of threats and intimidation under Draven's rule. Soldiers who had defected described orders they had been given to silence dissent through fear. Mira testified about the conversation Elena had overheard, and about the plot to free Draven before he could speak the truth to the council himself. And finally, Draven himself spoke, admitting to everything, including his desperate attempt to unleash the Bound One in a final, reckless bid to reclaim power he had already lost. "I wanted to prove myself worthy of what I believed I deserved," Draven said quietly, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "Instead, I nearly destroyed everything I claimed to want to protect. I have no excuse left to offer this council, only the truth, finally, for whatever it is worth at this point." The council deliberated for hours before returning with their judgment. Draven would not face execution, a mercy Elena suspected came directly from Cale's insistence despite everything his brother had done, but he would be stripped of all rank and title, exiled from Vareth territory for no fewer than 10 years, permitted to return only if the council one day deemed him rehabilitated and no longer a threat to the pack's stability. As Draven was led from the hall to begin his exile, he paused briefly beside Cale, who stood near the front of the gathered crowd, Elena at his side. For a long moment, the 2 brothers simply looked at each other, years of complicated history passing silently between them. "I am sorry," Draven said finally, quietly enough that only Cale and Elena standing close by could hear it. "For all of it. I do not expect forgiveness, and I do not deserve it. But I am sorry." Cale studied his brother for a long moment before answering. "I hope you find, out there, whatever it was you were truly searching for," he said. "I hope it was never really the throne at all." Draven said nothing further, simply nodding once before the guards led him away, out through the great doors and into the cold evening beyond, beginning a journey into exile that would take him far from the only home he had ever known. The hall slowly emptied after that, the crowd dispersing with quiet, relieved conversation, the weight of weeks of uncertainty finally beginning to lift from the valley. Elena remained standing near the front of the hall with Cale, watching the last of the evening light fade through the tall windows above. "It is truly over now," Cale said quietly, though there was more exhaustion than triumph in his voice. Elena reached for his hand, careful of the bandages still wrapped around his side from the injuries at the ruins. "Not over," she said gently, echoing words she had spoken to him once before on a very different battlefield. "Just changed into something new." Cale turned to look at her, something soft and searching in his expression. "I have been thinking about that," he admitted. "About what comes next, for the pack, and for us. You gave up everything to save my life in that barn, and every day since, this world has asked more and more of you in return. I would understand completely if, now that the danger has passed, you wanted to return to your old life, to your mother, to the farm we saved." Elena considered his words carefully, watching the last light fade over the mountains outside the tall windows. "My old life is still there," she said finally. "My mother, the farm, all of it. But something changed in me the morning I found you bleeding in those woods, something I do not think I can undo now even if I wanted to. I do not want to go back to who I was before that morning. I want to see what comes next, here, with you, if that is still something you want as well." Cale's answer was to draw her gently into his arms, careful of his healing wounds, and press a slow, grateful kiss to her forehead. Then, when she tilted her face up toward his, to her lips, soft and certain, in a way that finally felt less like a debt being repaid, and more like something neither of them had planned for, but both of them wanted with their whole hearts. Outside, word of Draven's exile and the pack's survival against the Bound One spread quickly through the valley, torches lighting one by one as families gathered to celebrate an ending that had, for weeks, felt impossibly far away. Elena stood at the tall windows with Cale's arm around her, watching the lights multiply across the darkening valley, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel grateful, without fear pressing in from every direction at once. There was still much ahead of them, a coronation to plan properly this time, a pack still healing from months of division and fear, a life together that neither of them fully understood yet how to build. But for the first time since that first gunshot had cracked through the trees behind her family's farm, Elena felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, with quiet surprise, as genuine peace. 3 weeks passed before the fortress finally settled into something resembling normal life, though normal, Elena was quickly learning, meant something very different in Vareth territory than it ever had on the farm. Mornings began with council briefings she was slowly learning to understand, afternoons filled with lessons from Mira about pack customs and history, and evenings spent with Cale reviewing the endless list of decisions that came with rebuilding a kingdom that had spent months divided by fear and betrayal. It was during one of those evenings, while going over reports from the surrounding villages, that a messenger arrived with news that made Elena's stomach drop before a single word had been spoken. Word from the human town near the old farm. "My king," the messenger said, bowing quickly. "There has been trouble. Men have been asking questions about a woman matching Elena's description, offering money to anyone willing to talk. They came to the farm 3 days ago." Elena was on her feet before Cale could respond. "My mother," she said, panic sharpening her voice. "Is she safe?" The messenger hesitated, and that hesitation alone told Elena everything she needed to know before he finally spoke. "Your mother was taken," he said quietly. "The men left a message behind, addressed directly to the king of Vareth." Cale's expression darkened instantly, all the careful calm of the past weeks vanishing in an instant. "What message?" he demanded. The messenger produced a folded paper, and Cale read it in silence before handing it wordlessly to Elena. The words were simple, cold, and precise. They knew about Elena. They knew about the bond, and they wanted something from Cale in exchange for her mother's safe return, something Elena's shaking hands could barely process as she read it. "They want the vault," she said, disbelief and fear warring in her voice. "The one from the ruins. They know about the Bound One, and they want access to the chamber where it is sealed." Kale took the paper back, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. This did not come from ordinary humans, he said grimly. Someone told them about the vault, someone who knew exactly what kind of leverage would force my hand. This has Draven's northern allies written all over it, people who lost everything when his rebellion collapsed and are looking for one last desperate way to gain power over Vareth territory. Elena's mind raced, fear for her mother colliding violently with the horror of what these people were asking for. We cannot give them access to that thing, she said. You saw what almost happened at the ruins. If people who do not understand what it truly is get anywhere near that chamber, it will not just be my mother in danger. It will be everyone. I know, Kale said quietly, pain evident in his voice despite his controlled expression. Which means we need another way to get her back. And we need to move quickly, before they realize we have no intention of honoring their demand. That night, a small team assembled in the war room. Mira, Owen, two of the pack's most skilled trackers, and Elena herself, who refused every attempt to be left behind, this time with a determination that left no room for argument. Kale laid out the location where the message indicated the exchange should take place, an abandoned mill on the outskirts of the human town, chosen, Elena suspected, because it sat close enough to Vareth territory to be convenient for the kidnappers, while still remaining far enough from Packlands to avoid immediate retaliation. We go in quiet, Kale said, studying a rough map spread across the table. Owen and the trackers scout the perimeter first, identify how many guards they have posted and where. Mira and I create a diversion at the main entrance while Elena's mother is moved to safety through a secondary route. We can only plan once we know the mill's layout for certain. And what do we offer them in place of the vault? One of the trackers asked. They will not simply release her for nothing. Kale's expression turned grim. We offer them exactly what they think they are getting, until the moment it matters, he said. A sealed container, dressed to resemble something valuable enough to be believable. By the time they realize it is empty, Elena's mother will already be safe, and we will have the location and identities of everyone involved in this plot. They departed before dawn, moving quickly through the mountain passes and down into the lower forests surrounding the human town Elena had once called home. The familiar landscape felt strange now, viewed through the lens of everything that had happened since she last walked these particular roads, and she found herself watching the tree line with a wariness that had not existed in her before. That first gunshot changed everything. The old mill came into view just as the sun began climbing over the horizon, its broken windows and sagging roof looking exactly as abandoned as she remembered from childhood trips into town. Owen and the trackers slipped away to scout the perimeter while the rest of the group waited in tense silence among the trees, and when they returned nearly an hour later, their report was not encouraging. 6 guards, armed, positioned at every entrance, Owen reported quietly. And your mother, he added, looking at Elena, is being held in the loft above the main floor, watched closely by at least 2 more. Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides. Then we move carefully, she said, though every instinct in her screamed to run inside immediately. We cannot afford mistakes with her life on the line. The plan they executed over the following hour was tense and precise. Mira and Kale approaching the main entrance openly, the container carrying what appeared to be a fragment of ancient stone carved with binding symbols pulled from old pack archives, convincing enough at a distance to hold the guards' attention, while Owen and the trackers slipped along the mill's exterior toward a broken section of wall near the loft. Elena, against every protest from Kale, insisted on accompanying them, unwilling to wait helplessly in the trees while her mother's fate was decided by others. They reached the loft just as raised voices echoed up from the main floor below, Kale's voice carrying clearly, buying time with careful, measured words while the exchange was examined by suspicious hands. Elena found her mother bound to a chair near the loft's edge, pale and frightened but unharmed, and the sight of her broke something loose in Elena's chest, relief crashing through her so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. She freed her mother's bindings as quietly as she could manage, Owen keeping watch at the loft's entrance, and had just helped her to her feet when a shout rang out from below, sharp and alarmed. "They have discovered the container is empty," Owen hissed. "We need to move now." They descended the far side of the loft as chaos erupted on the main floor. Kale and Mira already engaged with the guards who had realized the deception, buying precious seconds for Elena to guide her mother toward the broken section of wall and out into the trees beyond. Behind them, the sounds of fighting echoed through the old mill, and Elena forced herself not to look back, focusing entirely on getting her mother to safety exactly as she had once been ordered to do in a burning barn weeks earlier. They emerged into the pale morning light, just as reinforcements Kale had positioned along the tree line moved in to secure the area, and within minutes, the guards inside the mill, realizing they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, surrendered without further struggle. Kale emerged from the mill moments later, a fresh cut above his eyebrow but otherwise unharmed, and crossed the clearing immediately to where Elena stood with her mother, relief written plainly across his face. "Is she safe?" he asked, though he could see the answer clearly enough in the way Elena's mother clung to her daughter's arm. "Safe," Elena confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to you, and to everyone who came out here today for someone they had never even met." Elena's mother studied Kale for a long moment, taking in the sight of him properly for the first time, the same man Elena had described in halting, disbelieving detail weeks earlier. "So you are the wolf," she said finally, something like wonder in her tired voice. "I am," Kale confirmed, bowing his head respectfully. "And I owe your daughter more than I could ever properly repay, including, apparently, her mother's safety." Elena's mother looked between the two of them, something warm finally breaking through the fear still lingering in her expression. "Well," she said, a tired smile touching her lips, "it seems my daughter has a habit of saving lives that turn out to matter a great deal more than anyone expects." As the captured guards were secured and questioned, revealing exactly the connection to Draven's exiled allies that Kale had suspected, Elena stood in the morning light with her mother safely beside her, and Kale's hand finding hers, and understood that the threats to their world were not entirely finished, not while resentment and desperation still lingered among those who had lost everything when Draven's rebellion collapsed. But standing there, surrounded by people who had risked everything to bring her mother home, she also understood something else, with complete certainty, that whatever challenges still waited ahead, she would not be facing any of them alone. The interrogation of the captured guards took place over the following days, and the information they revealed confirmed exactly what Kale had feared. A small faction among Draven's former northern allies, unwilling to accept their fallen leader's exile and desperate to salvage some remnant of power from the collapse of his rebellion, had organized the kidnapping independently, believing that forcing Kale into surrendering access to the sealed chamber would give them enormous leverage over both Vareth territory and the northern packs alike. With names and locations extracted from the guards' testimony, Kale moved quickly and decisively, sending trusted envoys to the Northern Pack leadership with clear evidence of the plot and a firm warning that any further attempts against Vareth territory or its people, human or otherwise, would be treated as an act of open aggression. The Northern leadership, eager to distance themselves from the rogue faction and avoid conflict with a newly stabilized and clearly capable Vareth throne, moved swiftly to arrest those responsible, sending formal apologies and assurances of peace that arrived at the fortress within the week. For the first time since Elena had entered this hidden world, real quiet finally settled over the valley, the kind that did not feel like the tense pause before another crisis, but like something people could actually build a life within. Elena's mother, after much gentle persuasion from both Elena and Kale, agreed to relocate to Vareth territory permanently, given proper access to the pack's healers, whose ancient remedies, drawn from generations of accumulated knowledge, began improving her health within weeks in ways modern medicine back home had never managed. The old farm remained standing, fully paid off through the resources Kale had promised that very first morning after the fire. tended now by Elena's cousin and a rotating handful of trusted pack members who moved easily enough between both worlds when needed. The coronation, delayed for months by the chaos of Draven's rebellion and its aftermath, finally took place on a clear autumn morning. The entire valley gathered beneath banners bearing the silver wolf crest that had watched over Varath territory for generations. Elena stood near the front of the crowd beside her mother, watching as Chaol knelt before the full council to receive the formal blessing that would confirm him, at last and without any lingering doubt, as the rightful king his father had always intended him to become. When the ceremony called for the king to name his chosen partner before the assembled pack, Chaol rose and turned, not toward the council, but toward Elena, extending his hand across the distance between them with a certainty that needed no rehearsed words to carry its weight. "Weeks ago," Chaol said, his voice carrying easily across the silent crowd, "I told this council that I claimed a bond with Elena to repay a debt, to protect a woman who had sacrificed everything for a stranger she found dying in the woods. I want to stand before all of you today and say plainly that whatever began as a debt has become something else entirely. I do not ask you to recognize her as my queen out of obligation or protection any longer. I ask you to recognize her because I love her, because she has proven herself, again and again, worthy of standing beside anyone who leads this pack, human birth or not." Elena crossed the distance between them, her heart full in a way she had never quite experienced before that moment, and took his offered hand in front of the entire gathered valley. Mira, standing near the front with tears unashamedly bright in her eyes, stepped forward to complete the formal blessing, and the crowd's response, when it came, was not the hesitant murmur that had greeted Elena's first appearance in that hall months earlier, but something warmer, louder, unmistakably joyful. That evening, as celebrations spread through the valley, lanterns and bonfires lighting the darkness in every direction, Elena stood on the same stone balcony where Chaol had once promised her they would face whatever came next together, watching the light and laughter fill the world that had once seemed so impossibly foreign to her. She thought back, standing there, to that first cold morning in the woods, the gunshot, the wounded animal bleeding in the mud, the barn she had lost, the farm she had nearly lost along with it, every terrifying, uncertain step that had led her from that moment to this one. She had lost everything that morning, or so it had felt at the time, her job, her savings, the last physical remnant of her father's life on that farm. She understood now, standing beside the man she loved with her mother safe and healthy nearby, and an entire kingdom celebrating below, that she had not truly lost everything that day at all. She had simply made room for everything that came after, a life richer and stranger and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined choosing for herself, all because she could not bring herself to walk past a dying creature in the woods and pretend she had not seen him. Chaol joined her on the balcony as the celebrations continued below, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently against the top of her head as they both watched the lights of the valley flicker like stars fallen to earth. "Any regrets?" he murmured against her hair, his voice warm with quiet contentment. Elena leaned back into him, watching the fires burn bright against the dark mountains, and smiled. "Not one," she said softly. "Not a single one." Below them, the valley continued its celebration long into the night, the story of the woman who had lost everything saving a dying wolf, and the king who had returned to reclaim not only his throne, but his heart, already becoming the kind of legend the pack would tell for generations to come.